Germany, spring 1945. An American tank column enters a small town. The war's already lost. Everyone knows it, including those who are still firing. And then, from around the corner of a house, out of the rubble, a figure rises with a tube on its shoulder. The American gunner catches it in his sight and freezes for a second, because the figure is small. The helmet sits crooked and wobbles on its head. It's too big. The greatcoat drags along the ground. The sleeves rolled up. It's a child. He's maybe 14, maybe 12. He's holding a Panzerfaust, a single-use tube with a charge that can be fired exactly once. One shot. After that, either you've hit or you're just standing in the middle of the street in front of a tank, unarmed in plain sight. And here begins the question we're here for today. Why, in the final weeks of the war, when everything was already over, did German boys go out against armored columns with a tube that could fire only a single time? No one drove them forward with a machine gun at their backs. Many of them were never even formally conscripted. What's more, retreating soldiers of the Wehrmacht and the SS, men who had been through the entire war, came toward them and told them the same thing. It's over, go home. The veterans said this, and the boys walked on. Some looked at the retreating adults with contempt. How was that possible? Many people today explain it simply. They were forced, they were deceived, or they were fanatics. All three answers are too simple, and none of them explains the essential thing, because they really were deceived. But the deception was not the one people usually think of. They really weren't forced, and that is the most terrible part. The answer to this question is not about weapons and not about tanks. It's about what happens to a person who is being prepared for this from the age of 7. Part 1. A weapon made for children. Let's start with the tube on his shoulder, because it explains more than it seems. The Panzerfaust, a German anti-tank weapon. Simple to the extreme. A tube, a charge, a primitive sight. Single use, fire it and throw it away. And here is its key feature, the one it was created for. Anyone could fire it. You didn't need to be a soldier. You didn't need months of training. The instruction took minutes. The weapon was so simple that an 11-year-old child could fire it. And that's not a figure of speech. It was recorded by both the Germans and the Americans. Do you understand what this means? By 1944, Germany had created a weapon whose use required no soldier. It required only a person, anyone, of any age, and this weapon coincided perfectly with one terrible need. By the autumn of 1944, Germany's reserve of manpower was exhausted. More than 5 million soldiers had been lost. The ordinary sources of replacement had run dry. The army had scraped up everything. And then, on the 18th of October, 1944, the decree came creating the Volkssturm, the People's Militia. All men from 16 to 60 were subject to the call-up. Note the lower limit, 16. But even that didn't hold. Objections to using children younger than that were simply ignored. And now put the two facts together. On one side, a weapon a child can fire. On the other, a state with no adults left. These two things came together, and the result was predictable. American troops in Western Germany reported things that are hard to believe. Near Aachen, they were capturing armed 8-year-old children. They were knocking out artillery crews made up entirely of boys 12 and younger. One American lieutenant colonel described such a crew, where the oldest was 12, and added a phrase that leaves you uneasy. Instead of surrendering, the boys fought until they were killed. But a simple weapon and a shortage of soldiers explain what they fired with. They don't explain why they fired. Why a child, told leave by adult veterans, stayed. To understand that, we have to go back 10 years before that shot. Part 2. They had been prepared for 10 years. Here, we have to break the first expectation. We imagine that these children were seized in the final months, had a tube shoved into their hands, and were pushed out into the street. It was far worse. They weren't seized in 1945. They had been prepared since the mid-30s. A boy who was 14 in 1945 was born around 1931. He didn't remember a Germany without Hitler at all. For him, the Nazi state was not a regime, but simply the world, as natural as the weather. From early childhood, he passed through the age-graded organizations of the Hitler Youth. And this was not merely propaganda at meetings. It was a system that for years gave a child what children love most: a uniform, a banner, a sense of belonging, a sense of importance. He was told he was not a child, but a future soldier, that his generation was the chosen one, that the fate of the country depended on him, and alongside it ran military training. Not a game, real training, drill, shooting, field exercises. By the time the boys were needed at the front, they had behind them not weeks, but years of instruction. This is exactly why the Hitler Youth became the backbone of the Volkssturm. These children were better prepared than the old men called up alongside them. Now add the final layer. When the front reached Germany itself, the head of the Hitler Youth addressed them with a formula that explains everything. He proclaimed that out of the Hitler Youth had grown a movement of young tank destroyers. And he added, there is only victory or annihilation. Think about that. A child is told in plain words that there is no third option. Not try to survive, not fall back if it gets bad, victory or death. And a child who for 10 years had heard that he was chosen, that his generation would decide the fate of the nation. That child believes it. He doesn't see horror in it. He sees meaning in it. This is why the contempt for the retreating adults. The boys looked at exhausted veterans saying, "It's over, go home," and saw not wisdom. They saw cowardice. For 10 years, they had been taught that adults who doubted victory were traitors, and a veteran advising a child to go home was, in that child's eyes, exactly such a traitor. Do you understand where the central deception lies? They were not deceived in 1945. They weren't told some last-minute lie about victory being near. Many of them by that point had already seen everything collapsing. They were deceived in advance years before. It wasn't the facts that were swapped out. What was swapped out was the very frame of reference within which a person decides what to die for. And when the time came, deception was no longer needed. It was enough to hand over the tube. Part 3, what the Americans saw. And now, let's look at this from the other side of the gun sight, because this story has a second victim, one that's talked about less often. An American tanker or infantryman in the spring of 1945 found himself in a situation no one had prepared him for. Coming at him was an enemy in uniform, with a weapon, firing to kill. By all the laws of war, that's an enemy, but this enemy was a child, and a Panzerfaust in the hands of a 14-year-old killed exactly the same as in the hands of an adult. It pierced armor, it burned crews alive. A tank does not distinguish the age of the shooter. The American was faced with a choice that has no right answer. Don't fire, and possibly die yourself, along with your crew. Fire, and live with it afterward. Many tried to find a third path. The Americans often offered a chance to surrender, shouted for the children to drop their weapons. Sometimes it worked. A significant portion of Volkssturm units at the first serious clash simply scattered or surrendered, especially those made up of ordinary mobilized workers and old men. But where the boys of the Hitler Youth stood, it was different. Cornered, they often fought to the last, rather than surrender, and that left the Americans with only one way out. Here is the second side of the tragedy. The German state placed its own children between the American tanks and its own inevitable defeat. It didn't save a single city this way, nor did it delay the collapse. The Volkssturm's effect on the course of the war was negligible, but it forced other people's soldiers to kill children, and its own children to die for nothing. Both sides of this equation were victims of the same decision. Part 4, the verdict. Let's bring it all together. The German boys went out against American tanks not because they were stupid, and not because they were driven by force. Something else destroyed them, and it needs to be named precisely. First, the weapon. Germany created the Panzerfaust, a weapon so simple that it erased the difference between a soldier and a child. Once such a weapon exists and the adults have run out, a temptation appears that the regime failed to resist. Second, the upbringing. These children were prepared not for months but for 10 years. From early childhood, a world was built for them, in which death for one's country is not a tragedy, but the fulfillment of a destiny. They were given a uniform, pride, and a sense of being chosen long before they were given the tube. And third, the timing. They were sent against the tanks at the moment when the war was already lost, and when not one of their deaths could change anything. Their sacrifice was not just terrible, it was useless, and the adults giving the orders knew it. Here is the main thing worth carrying away from this. You don't have to deceive a child at the moment you hand him a weapon. It's enough to deceive him for 10 years before that. Then, on the last day, he goes on his own, and he doesn't even have to be forced. He'll believe that he chose it himself. And the bitterest part, those who arranged this knew the war could not be saved. They were not defending Germany with children. They were prolonging their own final weeks at the children's expense. The boy in the oversized helmet, raising the tube toward an American tank on the street of a German town, knew none of this. He knew that he was chosen, that the fate of the country depended on him, that the retreating adults were traitors, that there was only victory or annihilation. He was 14 or 12, and he had exactly one shot. If this story made you think, leave a like. It helps the channel reach those who want to understand history seriously rather than retell legends. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember this, the most dangerous weapon is not the one that's easy to load. The most dangerous is the one that's easy to place in a child's hand, having convinced him that he's an adult. Germany built such a weapon and such an upbringing at the same time. And in the spring of 1945, they met on the streets of its own cities.